Hello and welcome. My name is Yoshi Silverstein. I'm the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective. So delighted to welcome all of you to our conversation, Us and Us, centering the margins of racial identity in the Jewish climate movement. A couple of notes as we get into this. First off, we're going to spend about the first hour of our time together in a conversation between myself and our other two conversationalists, who we'll welcome on in just a moment. We will then follow that with about 30 minutes of Q&A. So for everyone who is on, you can be submitting Q&A through the Q&A button, and we'll be monitoring those as we go along, but we'll mostly be holding off on actually answering those until that final chunk of time. We will also have the chat open to panelists, so we will try to keep a bit of an eye on that. I should say panelists, I should say conversationalists. We'll try to keep an eye on that, but we cannot promise that we will always see everything coming through the chat because we're going to be in our conversation with each other. The last thing I'll say is that we do have our live transcriptions or captions available, so you should see the button to turn those on in the bottom of your screen, if that is something that is helpful for you. So with that, I am delighted to welcome on my co-conversationalists, Kristy Drutman and Nate Looney. Hello, welcome. We often think of, so when we're talking about environmental racism, this is I hope it's clear to everyone joining us, this is a really important issue. It's a really important part of how we bring intersectionalism into our work, whether we are nature educators or we're climate activists or sustainability buffs or whatever it is, recognizing the ways in which these issues are not actually isolated to just thinking about, our relationship to nature or just thinking about carbon emissions and all of that, right? This idea of intersectionality is that actually these things, these different issues that we sometimes talk about in isolation have intersection points, right? And they impact each other, they influence each other, and actually we can't really fully talk about most of these things without talking about other things along the same way. And so this question of environmental racism in general is really important. We've been happy to see a lot of sessions throughout the whole festival that are talking about climate justice and talking about racism and how it plays out sort of within this context. And yet often we think of this as a question that is of our relationship as Jews and or Jewish community to the other, right? And we sort of think, okay, racism impacts the other, the strangers, the ger, right? And so what's our obligation as Jews to be thinking about the relationship? And that's really important. Don't get me wrong, it's really important. But it's also incomplete, right? Because Jews are not monolithic and Jews are not monoracial. We are multiracial. And so in this conversation, we are going to be talking about our experiences as Jews of color who are working at the intersections of nature connection, environmental activism, farming, service, and Jewish education. And we're going to share a vision of what it looks like to do this work both individually and collectively from a place of wholeness. So in a moment, we are going to introduce ourselves. The one other note that I'll make is that this is going to be we're going to try to have this be a conversation with the three of us, and we're delighted that so many are on to listen in. But we're trying to keep this from being sort of a formal panel, right, and more of just really a conversation that flows between the three of us. And so I hope that is also something that is enjoyable and edifying to listen to if you're in the audience. The last thing I want to do here, and this is part of, I think, how we really have this conversation, not just in our heads, right, but from a place of wholeness, means that we're also bringing this conversation and the speaking and the listening into our bodies. And so I want to borrow this practice from Resma Menachem of orienting to our bodies and orienting to space. So I'll invite Nate and Kristy to do this, but also maybe even especially if you are on the audience side of the screen and watching in, I invite you to do this with us. So first, just take a nice deep breath, sit up in whatever seat you are. If you're able to put your feet on the ground, Just take a nice deep breath. We're going to orient to our space. So first I'm going to go ahead and tilt my head so that I'm looking all the way up. Just keep on breathing in and out. And then I'm going to come all the way back through the center and then looking down. Feeling just a little bit of a stretch through the spine and through the neck as I do this. And up. And now I'm going to turn my whole torso, so not just my head, but also my spine and my hips, so that I'm looking all the way 180 degrees behind me, and just pause, looking back for a few moments. It's nice and slow, come back to center, and let's go the other way. Really feeling the stretch and the twist through our spine and through our hips. Let's come back to center. Let's take a nice deep breath. And we're here. So Nate, Kristy, let's introduce ourselves to each other and to everyone who's listening in. Nate, would love for you to start off, just to share, who are you, where are you, what are some of the identities that you're holding with you and bringing into this space, and who are we bringing and holding in this space in terms of our, ancestors and elders and teachers.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm Nate Looney, and who am I? I'm a manager of racial justice initiatives at Avodah. And then in addition to that, I'm a urban farmer specializing in controlled environments. And where am I? I'm on the West Coast, sunny, somewhat rainy California, Southern California, Long Beach. And one thing that I want to talk about is like some of the identities that I'm bringing to this space. As Yoshi mentioned, that there's an intersectionality component to who we are. So for me, I'm bringing the fact that I'm a fifth generation farmer. I'm the descendant of enslaved peoples. I'm the child of an immigrant. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, a queer trans person. All of these things, an entrepreneur. All of these things inform, my opinions and what I bring into this space. And someone in particular that I'm holding in this space, and I'll share about this a little bit later, is my grandmother's grandfather, Horace Hill, who started our family farm in Louisiana. The farm's still in existence today. And so whenever I'm in conversations like this, I like to hold him because he was a revolutionary of his time. And I'm really grateful to be in this space and happy to be in a conversation with the two of y'all.
Thanks so much, Nate. Kristy, what about you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristy Drutman. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am based in the Bay Area. Right now, I'm in Los Angeles. And I hold the identities of being both Filipino American and also Jewish American. And so I come from, Southeast Asian background and also just exploring my Jewish identity, which is like a new exploration for me in the past few years. And I come with a background of creating my own podcast and media series called Brown Girl Green, which is focused on highlighting and uplifting the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the environmental movement, as well as making climate solutions and sustainable living more accessible to more people. Who I'm bringing into this room right now is my grandma Frances and my Lola Mary, who both sadly departed when I was younger, but I bring them into this space because they are really at the key of why I'm here today.
Thanks so much. And I'm Yoshi Silverstein. I'm a Chinese Ashkenazi American Jew. I live in Shaker Heights, Ohio, right outside the city line of Cleveland, on land that is predominantly was in relationship with the Erie and Mississauga people, amongst quite a number of other folks. I'm the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective, which is a new organization that our mission is to build resilient community through embodied Jewish practice and racial equity. A number of important identities that I'm holding in this space, holding my identity as an educator, as someone who really deeply connects with nature and place, bringing my identity of, on my father's side, Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, And for my mom's side, of Chinese folks from on my grandma's side, Hakka Chinese, and then on my grandpa's side, Cantonese. Folks who also sort of went in my grandma's way via Guyana, where she actually was born and raised. So there's some like funny little Caribbean, influences in terms of her identity, and I'm just thinking of the like little curry chicken, curry pies that she used to make, that are like not a Chinese food, right? But made their way into our bellies as a kid. And so, I'm holding a lot of ancestors with me in this space. On my dad's side, my great grandpa Harry, who I learned recently was actually a shochet, a kosher slaughterer. And then my Zaidi, my grandfather, also my dad's dad, Jay, who later in life had an avocado grove in the San Diego area, and so clearly some relations or some connections to food and nature from that side, and then also my grandma Ivy, my mom's mom, who, as I mentioned, grew up in Guyana, and sort of I feel embody this whole just journey through so many different places in the world. And then my grandpa Jimmy, also on my mom's side, who was born in Canton Province and moved to the States when he was 12 or 13 to Texas, and grew up in the back of a grocery store that his family owned during the Depression, was a veteran, fought in World War II, actually at the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. Stayed behind to help rebuild Europe, was part in some way of like liberating my, European Jewish cousins through that. And then also spent some time as a butcher. So some like really amazing, just like threads, common threads that have woven through. So I'm bringing them all into this conversation. And I'm also bringing in a number of elders and teachers, particularly in the Jews of color space, that I have been so fortunate to learn from and be in community with. And I'm not going to name any names just because I fear that I'll leave somebody really important out. But if you think I'm talking about you, I am. So I'll just put it that way. I'm so grateful to have learned from all of those folks and continue to be in community. So we want to start this conversation from a place of joy and nourishment and wholeness, right? I think there's, I imagine many folks on the call are familiar with the concept of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, and this idea that there is great brokenness in the world, and it's a deeply Jewish thing to fix that brokenness. But I think part of that is also recognizing where we find aspects of wholeness, right? To be able to really lift up and elevate, and also to give us guidance in terms of just where are we going, and what are we repairing, towards what end. So let's start from that place of wholeness and nourishment. What brings us into this work, and what is it that we bring or receive? We've just mentioned our ancestors, our elders, the identities that we carry with us. So what of those things really feed and nourish us in terms of what brings us into our work, our relationship to nature and community and climate and all of those things? Kristy, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I would say something that's really important to me as a content creator is just figuring out how to have fun with a lot of this work, because it can be very hard and depressing, especially getting information overload. And so I focus on the ways to use storytelling and content creation as a way to address my own shame around, the environmental crises of our time. And, as I've learned about, Jewish culture, and just wanting to understand what shame means and how to heal from that, and how to really embrace your joy, and that is radical resistance. And I think I bring a lot of my perspective of wanting to honor my ancestors who weren't able to have the same freedoms as me, to speak my mind, to be able to stand up for what I believe in, to be able to speak on injustices happening in our society. I always think about the ways in which I believe they'd be really proud of me, and also just my own ability to know that I'm carving out paths for other people who look like me, who may have felt like they didn't have a place in this movement, or even were allowed to call themselves Jewish. I try to really feel out that there's a lot of people like me who aren't even aware that spaces like this exist. And so with Brown Girl Green and the content that I make as a content creator, and just also as someone who, you know, consults on diversity, equity, inclusion, and has all these workshops, you know, I've been trying to build this kind of ethos or this understanding of what it means to address shame, especially for people of color who feel like they're not allowed to, you know, be in a room, to take leadership, to be outspoken. And I try to always like be that person that's challenging that. And I think having a mixed race identity and coming from both being, you know, half Jewish, and, or I don't even like saying half Jewish, like being just mixed race. I think I have all these perspectives that I bring into a room that allows me to adapt to different situations, which I think is really necessary as we're doing movement work, because we're not just attached to this, oh, let me put you in this box. You have to exist in these ways and you're constrained. I try to always like break down those barriers as often as possible.
I really appreciate what you just said about not being, put into a box. And because it's often because, I do agricultural work and urban agriculture, and then I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work at the same time. It's like, okay, now you're in this box, and then now you're in the farming box. But, this conversation right now is a really good example of that interwovenness of the work. And so I think for me, what brings me to this work is thinking about the future and future generations. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a fifth generation farmer. My grandmother's grandfather's parents were enslaved. So 7 generations to the past, my lineage includes enslavement. So what does it look like, knowing that we're not that far away from that? What does 7 generations to the front look like? And what is our responsibility now around sustainability to ensure that there is a place in existence 7 generations to the future? Um, and one of the things that I feel like I receive from my ancestors and traditions bringing it into this work is the understanding that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. This is not something that we are not the first ones to be doing this work. And so for me, I find it a wellspring of strength to think about the people that were doing this work before us that didn't quite have the access, the resources, the credibility, or the time, or the airspace to really talk about these things. In addition to my grandmother's grandfather, I think about George Washington Carver and how so much of who we are today and what is a part of our world is directly related to his research and inventions. I also think about Fannie Lou Hamer and her ability to speak truth to power in all instances. And so I kind of pull from that for myself as I do this work, understanding that it's not my job to finish it, but it's also not my job to walk away from it. It's just it's such it's like, as we're talking about this, I just was thinking about like Sukkot and how we call people into the sukkah. And it's like, even though we're in this conversation with the three of us, I feel like each of us are pulling people into this virtual sukkah of the moment, and that alone gives me strength and nourishment in this. When I think about how I navigate as a farmer, I bring the teachings of Maimonides into my work. And what does it mean to understand that the closer you are, the more you understand science, the more you have to have a connection to a higher creator or a higher being, because there's only so much that we can do as humans. And so all of those different components are a part of it for me.
Yeah, God, there's so much that it's like resonating for me right now. I mean, I think the ways that Nate, you said, bringing our ancestors and also just folks who may not be ancestors, are like living folks that are living ancestors, bringing them into this space with us. That ushpizin is that word for the sort of these like honored guests. And I love that there's some sort of traditional folks of like, like Avraham and Sarah and like etc. Like sort of like the greats, you know, in the Jewish story. And then I love this practice of like, and then on a personal level, like who are those people? So I love that imagery of creating this virtual, we're in this virtual sacred, you know, sukkah space. It's like impermanent, right? Like at the end of this, we'll click leave on the Zoom link and like the sukkah will disappear. But I love that. And I think, so yeah, when I think about, for me, the, what brings me into this work, for sure at the start, I mean, I was lucky enough that my parents for preschool sent me to a Montessori preschool that was housed in an arboretum. So, you know, it's like kind of, it's like, it's not surprising that I've gone into this work of Jewish nature education and a love for the outdoors. It's sort of like I almost understand how, like, how did anybody who was in class with me not go into, not, you know, maybe they weren't all Jewish, so different ways, but like, you know, set such a foundation for me. And I think, you know, what I also found is both that I had a really deep and innate spiritual connection to being in nature, and that my the practices and tools that I was learning through my Jewish education and being involved in Jewish learning and gaining these practices really like gave me the toolkit to explore that spiritual connection in a way that felt really grounded in this tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And you know, and then in some ways it's actually just been more recently, we'll talk about maybe more about this later, but the ways in which I'm also sort of increasingly exploring from my other side, you know, what are the sort of Eastern, so to speak, you know, the Chinese and Asian tools that I have some of, but I feel like not the depth that I have in there. So yeah, when I think about ancestors and what feeds and nourishes, I mean, food, like literally food is a huge thing has been for my family. And I try to continue that, right. And take recipes that that have been passed down to me. You know, I think also about, Kristy, you were talking about the ways that, I think that our ancestors like the lives that we live now, right, are like our ancestors' greatest dream. I don't know if you said exactly, but it made me think of that phrase. And I saw somebody post on Twitter recently, like, I am my ancestors' greatest hallucination, which is just like it's not a nightmare, right? That's important to note. Like maybe for some, you know, and those are the ancestors that maybe we don't want to claim so much of that lineage from, you know. But it's just like there's so much that our ancestors just like could not in their wildest dreams even imagine, because it's so different. You know, and I think as nutty as that may be, there's a lot of richness to just sort of noticing that. And so I think about that. And then Nate, from you were saying about 7 generations, I think you know, I've been learning a lot more about you know, there's just a lot more research going into this of sort of like epigenetics and the ways that trauma is encoded in our DNA and passes down from one generation to the other. And it goes back, I forget, you know, I think it goes back at least 7 generations ago. You know, which is one I think helps us to just understand so much about why why we are how we are, and the things that, you know, we think of as just being part of who we are. I mean, they are part of who we are, but like there's a through line. And so, you know, in that, like on the one hand, it's sort of like, okay, there's like these are some ways in which the trauma from my ancestors might be manifesting. But we also, I think it's really important to remember also, here's the beauty and the joy that also must have been encoded equally into our DNA. And so being able to tap into, you know, understand and tap into both of those things, and then thinking about projecting 7 generations down the line, it's like I mean, it's kind of a lot of pressure, but it's also like, what are the things that I'm doing now to create the healing and that wholeness that is getting encoded, right, and is passing down both through the DNA, and then of course, and then also through just the teaching and creation of culture and all of those things. So yeah, those, I don't know, I feel like I could ramble on. There's, you know, there's I don't know, there's more, but yeah. Kristy, where should we take it from here?
Yeah, this is great. Well, thank you for sharing all those thoughts. I think it is really important to think about, like, you know, where we're at, the legacy, you know, we're trying to leave, the communities we're trying to serve at all times. And I think a big part of that is talking about the reality of environmental racism. And for people who don't know what environmental racism is, it's basically, I mean, this is my own take on the definition, but it's essentially like, institutions and location-based, histories that have basically caused racial disparities, that environmental health disparities based on racial and ethnic lines. So basically, you see these communities that are called fence line communities who live very close to facilities that are polluting, they're toxic. You see communities like Flint, Michigan, that had their water poisoned. And people neglected and denied their realities of what was happening. There's so many examples of environmental racism, but a lot of it has to do with, in my opinion, gaslighting, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. For their experiences, there's a lot of just denial that environmental racism is even a real thing. There's denial that there's any impact on the quality of air, water, and land people have access to, when we're seeing time and time again studies showing that Black and brown communities have way worse quality of air compared to white folks. And we're continuing to see these trends of especially low income communities in inner cities not having access to green spaces, parks, forests, etc. So we're continuing to see this disconnect between communities of color having access to nature. And if communities of color don't have access to nature, having this conversation about taking action on climate change seems really abstract. It seems very inaccessible. It seems like a conversation that belongs to other people who don't look like the people who are on this panel today. And I think that we're all bringing this perspective as Jews of color, that we want to shift that conversation, because if we are going to bring more people into this conversation around advocacy, we have to first start at where these disparities start. And so if we don't address that, then we're kind of just saying, oh, we're all one. We all are experiencing the same things, when we're not. And when we don't address that, we're not going to actually pass legislation or get funding passed that's actually going to make a profound impact on the communities who need it the most. So I just wanted to know, what do you think are some of the main issues around environmental racism that concern you, and why do you think there's so many barriers around us in this space talking about that? And we'll start with Yoshi.
Cool. Yeah, I think one, just seeing a note in the chat, right, about it's not only access to nature, it's that communities of color are adversely impacted by industrial pollution. And so yes, absolutely, it's the access, and then it's also the adverse impacts on marginalized communities. And yeah, I mean, I think the one major thing you talked about, the where did these discrepancies start, right? And sort of how we have to recognize those roots in order to move forward. And one of the ways that is really important for me to think about is particularly talking in a U.S. context, that we need to recognize that at the founding of this country, there were these two, what sometimes folks talk about as the two original sins of this country, that laid the foundwork for then what has woven its way throughout really everything that's our society. And so first of all, the original sin of folks coming over here and committing a genocide on the indigenous people who were already here. And just the both the actual literal genocide over the course of generations, whether that was through violence, through illness, through all of these different things, and then also through displacement. And I think when we're talking about environmental racism and talking about our relationship to land and place, right? I think of that the violence of tearing people from their home, and displacement, and the way that's played out over centuries. Somewhat more recently, think about the Trail of Tears, for example, and the way that's just torn communities apart, who had the original relationship. So that's the first one. And then the second one is the slave trade, and stealing folks from their land and bringing them to this land, right? Enslaving them. And I mean, of course, all of the horrors of U.S. American slavery that went on for hundreds of years, and only, it's like the blink of an eye, the time that's passed since slavery ended, let alone then like ongoing, um, you know, policies and practices. I'm talking about like Jim Crow and just, everything. When we think about the civil rights movement, like that was a few decades ago, right? Like so many of the leaders of civil rights, that was our parents and grandparents they're like, it's like really, really, like it just like sometimes it feels like it was long, but it really wasn't. So anyway, so like those, yeah, when I think about those two original sins, it's the and then the way that that has set up the structural facets based on racist ideology, and also based on white supremacy, right? Based on and so those were two specific ones, and then of course there's been other things along the way. I'm thinking about like the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, like the one group of folks that like the one group of immigrants that were like actively for a portion of time like named of like you can't come here, right? And so just the ways that written into the fabric of the society was this assumption that white folks, and specifically like people in white bodies, inherently have more value, have more worth, are more human than people who are not in white bodies. And so from a fundamental like roots level, like that's at the root to me. And then there's all the ways in which that plays out, right? But it's like it comes down to like that basic premise that really most of our society is based on, and we have to understand that to then swim against the current.
I kind of want to piggyback on what you said about um, the original sins of the founding of this country, because I often think about the intergenerational trauma and connection to the land for people of color, specifically Black African American folks. It's almost a negative thing to be connected to the land because we have so much historic trauma associated with working the land and having that connection. Um, but if I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the roots and impacts, we can't talk about the climate crisis in the United States without also talking about racial equity. Because the two are so intertwined that you can't talk about one in a vacuum without having to address the other one. Let's think about where are where's the most damage being done? It's being done in communities that are disenfranchised, and that disenfranchisement didn't just start happening with Reagan and Reaganomics or something like that. This is something that has been an ongoing thing from Reconstruction forward. So if you can't vote, or if it's potentially going to end your life for you to try to vote, then you have no say in where the nearest factory is to your home. And once you've set up in that home, if you wherever you live, not having the resources to move. We talk about white flight from certain areas. When housing projects were built, it was because people had the resources to be able to leave. So you have a compounded issue where it's like you can't afford to leave, and you don't have a voice in what's going on in your own backyard. That has had a long-standing impact. Generation after generation of that happening, it almost becomes a point where it's like, why even try? So it's really interesting that the work that we're doing now, and that I see for myself, in the controlled environment agricultural world, it's that, we have an issue in California where it's raining right now in Los Angeles, but we have limited resources around water. So if this is a trend that we potentially see continuing, what does it mean to create new food sources and new sustainable sources? And at the same time, bring people of color into the industry in a way that gives independence and autonomy. It's I think each one of us we approach this work from a different parameter, but for me, it's about creating that internal stability. Look, I know what it feels like to be food insecure. And the impact that has. If we talk about the educational implications of a child going to class hungry or without proper nutrition, it has an impact on their ability to learn. And then in addition to that, the fact that they're not having nutritional food has an additional impact on their health outcomes. We see this over and over with COVID-19 in Black and brown neighborhoods, that the mortality rate seems to coincide with communities that have the least access to health resources, and also are facing the most exposure to toxicity. And I think that this is something, it's going to be an ongoing issue. But the one thing that I mean, it's like I will hit it home a million times, is that you can't separate the two, climate justice and racial equity inclusion. The two absolutely have to be intertwined in all of this work that we do. And so I kind of want to circle us around to like talking about what's the Jewish point of all of this. It's like we were talking about, the civil rights movement wasn't that long ago. But at the same time, when we talk about the Jewish community's role in race and racial justice, it's often something that we fall back on, is like, okay, well, Heschel was present, and Jews were a part of the freedom rides, and we're done. Like, we don't have to do anything else. And the truth is that, like, there is a lot more work to be done, and I think to a certain degree we are at the infancy in the Jewish community as far as really doing this racial justice work. But that's also a good thing, because that means that we have a long ways to go. And the fact that there are, so as many people watching and tuned into this conversation means that folks understand that this is a bigger issue. So for myself, I can say that there's a lot of things that have gone well. The fact that this is a topic that we're talking about right now, like I said, is great. But I think that it's important to recognize that mistakes are going to happen in this work, and that there have been things that haven't gone so well. So, we talk about tokenization in the broader POC, people of color community. What does tokenization look like within our own Jewish climate justice work? What is it? It's important to have one person, have Jews of color at the table, but only having one or two is problematic. And so I think that part of the through line is what does it look like for Jews of color, people of color, to be vertically integrated into all aspects of climate justice focused organizations? I wouldn't say that we've been explicitly excluded, but our existence hasn't always been acknowledged.
I mean, sometimes.
So yeah, it hasn't always been excluded, but but sometimes it has explicitly been excluded. But the question then becomes like, what is, so for y'all, what does it look like? What do you all think that has gone well or wrong within the Jewish community as it relates to racial justice and climate justice, and how do y'all see the role of Jews of color, in this current conversation?
Yeah, I guess I'll start off because I know there's a lot we want to share on this. I think one big thing is just like acknowledging that Jews of color exist, acknowledging that that's like a real thing, especially like, I don't know, in media portrayals or just like the mainstream, like you don't really hear as much about Jews of color. And I mean, even for me, like I didn't really even know how like my identities could ever intersect until like I was in college and actually did a research report where I learned that the Philippines was like a huge haven for Jewish people during the Holocaust. And I was like, whoa, everything is coming together. And anyways, it was just like a big deal for me. It was like it was a big turning point where I was like, wow, like, my identities can intersect here, and there needs to be more stories like this that are told that tie the Jewish identity with like also existing as a person of color and having to navigate that. And there needs to just be more support of those stories. There needs to be just more encouragement for those stories to be brought to light, whether that be through poetry or writing or film, etc. I think from a media standpoint, it's definitely lacking. And then I think from just like a practical standpoint, in the environmental field, there's just like a lot of unpaid internships, like lack of compensation, that prevents a lot of people of color from participating. There's also just a lot of barriers to entry around like networking and mentorship, and also just feeling like you can find other people who share similar lived experiences as you and like understand those like struggles and barriers that maybe you're facing navigating this space. Because I know for me personally, like it was really confusing, because I was like, oh, like none of this really like makes sense, or I can't really find other people who relate to me. And so I just felt really like alone in that. And so I think that it's important that people, one, think about compensation and how to like properly compensate people of color, especially if you're going to have them talk about social justice, racial justice, because that's like really exhausting, and like we should be getting compensated for that kind of work. And then two, like creating more pathways and avenues for mentorship, career development for young Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are Jewish, you know, too, for the people of this audience, figuring out like how are we creating like avenues for the next generation to feel supported in that, not just folks who have like intergenerational wealth and connections to white privilege who can like navigate those spaces a lot easier. And I think those are things we need to like start thinking about, because if we again pretend that there's not these barriers to entry, and also like just a lot of like barriers to advancing your career in this space, we're like preventing a large part of the population who like don't even, you know, that are Jews of color from like being a part of this conversation. And so just to like start us off with that, I think that's where I want to begin with. And then there's other thoughts I have, but I want to give Yoshi space as well.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Kristy. I think pulling from a couple pieces of what you're saying. One, just yeah, to reiterate, because you can't say enough. Like, hey, Jews of color exist, and just, I mean, it's we're getting better there, but it's still we're moving against a lot of, you know, negative inertia around just that knowledge, and you know, and so the Jews of Color Initiative has been doing a lot of tremendous work that, you know, as Nate was saying, like builds off the backs of so many giants who have been doing this work for decades, right? So even if folks just heard the term Jew of color, you know, 4 months ago or a year ago, as it started to enter the discourse more commonly, like the work goes back. You know, there's folks who've been doing this for decades. And, you know, like, thank God it's finally sort of getting more traction, but let's also recognize how much hard work has gone into it. And so, you know, I would say for anyone in the audience who's not familiar, like, you know, go to Rabbi Google and Google Jews of Color Initiative, Google, like, what should I know about Jews of Color? Like, I don't want to, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to use up too much time about that, but I will say there's 12 to 15% minimum of the Jewish community is estimated, with our best data, which is incomplete and is not the best data available, right? But 12 to 15% is the current estimates of Jews of color in the Jewish community. And so that means if there's 7 million Jews in the United States, 1 million are Jews of color. So that specific number I want to pull out, because 1 million is like, it's huge, right? And so let's name that. And then this, you know, the second thing is then we're thinking about like, and this is something that I know folks are talking about throughout the Jewish community, is saying, you know, so now we know this is roughly how many Jews of color there are. And yet when we look in our Jewish communities, they do not reflect that proportion. So that 12 to 15%, 1 out of every 7, right? So in a minyan, you should have like a 1.5 or what, right? Let's not do the partial human thing. Let's go for 2, right? Let's go for 2 people in a minyan or more that are Jews of color. And that's also not necessarily including Sephardi Mizrahi. I'll just say, like, some Sephardi Mizrahi do consider themselves JOC, some don't. It gets complex. So so I've been in the Jewish environmental world for most of my career, and yeah, just, you know, it's like, is it any worse than most Jewish communal spaces? No, definitely not much better, right? So Well, so is that again? It's that same thing of like we look around and we see a lot of white Jews, and we're saying like, well, where are the Jews of color? And and as folks start to get more um, aware and more cognizant of that question of like, okay, so where, like, all right, we know that they're out there. Where are they? Why aren't they coming into our spaces? And this makes me think of some work I did in grad school, doing some research assistantship work that was looking, and this was for landscape design, landscape architecture, but it was looking at public nature spaces. Like the work generally was looking at public nature spaces and like um, aspects of racial marginalization in those spaces, and sort of asking the question of like, why aren't black and brown folks showing up in our national parks or in our city parks or in this and that and blah blah blah. And the research, I mean, obviously research has to get into narrow questions, but it's saying, oh, maybe like the cultural backgrounds are different and we're not designing the city parks to align with like so and so communities cultural practices and blah 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 blah. And like, yes, those are all facets of it, but it's sort of like sometimes I feel like we do so much to skirt around, like, actually it's probably just racism, right? And like, and racism has, there's a lot of, it plays out in so many different ways, but it's like sometimes I feel like we do so much dancing around, and that just like naming racism is why so many people of color are excluded from communities, and the same is true in the Jewish environmental community, right? And so last thing I want to touch on right in this moment is then just is representation. And I mean, Kristy, you were talking about so many different ways in which we can increase that representation. And I just want to tell you all this story that, I really only kind of, this recognition or realization that I had really within the last year or so, that I think speaks to the importance of representation. And so when I was young in high school, I think, maybe early college, I read, on my mom's recommendation, I read this book called The Jew and the Lotus. It's a great book. It's written by Roger Kamenetz, and it's there's sort of two threads in the book. The one is it tells a story of how the Dalai Lama arranged a meeting with a bunch of sort of emissaries from the Jewish community, and he sort of was like, I am now responsible for leading my people in exile. The Jews have been doing that for a couple thousand years. Like, tell me how you did that, right? So like, really fascinating question and conversation. So the book talks about that whole series of conversations and meetings. But then the other thread is it explores this whole trend of Jews who, starting in the 60s-ish, started exploring like Eastern traditions of Buddhism and meditation and various healing practices, all of these things. And like one of the sort of central theses of the book that I remember was sort of this idea of exploring that trend, but also this idea that actually, and this is part of like Jewish renewal and different practices, is that like so many of these things that people were going outside of Judaism to explore actually have parallel roots in Jewish practice. And so how a lot of this led to sort of a rebirth of Jewish mysticism and mindfulness practice and meditation and all of these things. But one of the sort of inherent assumptions that was in that book was that when we're talking about Jewish, we're talking about predominantly white, right? Like Ashkenazi, tracing back through that path, right? And so that's half my lineage, is like Ashkenazi, European, white, Jewish. When I was reading that book, I almost entirely and only like exclusively identified with that question of like, well, if I have meditation practices and mindfulness, blah, blah, in my Jewish background, that's where I should be turning to find the practices. I should be learning more about Kabbalah. I should be learning more about and study with so-and-so Jewish people, blah, 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 right? That's the book is called The Jew and the Lotus. So it was sort of like, why should I look that way when it's all right here? It took me like, we're talking like maybe 2 decades or at least a decade and a half, where I was talking with a friend who's also Chinese and Jewish. And it was in the midst of this, and I was like, wait a second. I'm also Chinese. like I have equal, authentic lineage to like all of the Eastern stuff, like, right? And so in my case, there's like all the reason to be exploring those things. And it just sort of made me realize like, and I think one of the ways that being a Jew of color, just in general, plays out for me. I think this is, there are particularities here. So this is specifically for me as an Asian Jew of color, is that I have found that one, like my Jewish community growing up was my home, and that's important. But I think also part of what, as you sort of like, especially if you're one of very, very few and you start to navigate that space, it's very easy for like your othered identity to sort of be subsumed by the identity of the majority. And so I sort of feel like I got really good at like being an Ashkenazi Jew, right? And like chanting Torah and leading services and blah, blah, blah. And like I'm a Jewish professional now, right? So like literally, got like developed these skills as a professional. And specifically in the Jewish environmental movement, it's like there's a bunch of people who have been doing really amazing work, and it's like one pathway for the work. And what I've realized is that there are ways in which I have sometimes consciously, often subconsciously, tried to mold myself into the leaders who have forged the path, but in doing so have left behind these aspects of my identity that are the ones that are different, and have left behind part of myself that actually, as I've created more openness for bringing it in, has made, at least for me, the work so much richer. And so I think that's where, just like pulling it back here, the representation is like, we need more ways to do the work, right? And so, let me just call it out, like white bearded hippie dude with a guitar is one modality, and it's a great one. Now I'm also a song leader, but like, and I also have a beard, but like, but it's like, okay, so can I tap into that? Yes, but also that's not the whole version of me. And so being able to tap into this and think, okay, what is the fully whole and authentic version that I can bring into my work, that gives me more nourishment, and also hopefully opens things up so that more people can see themselves in the work, and just have a sense of like, oh, this is work that I could be doing. And I also would argue that it's like, we're not going to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish if we're not making the space for all of the different ways to do the work. So sorry, I rambled for a long time. Nate, you should say something.
Yeah, no, I was listening and doing like yep, the whole time. But it's interesting something that you mentioned early on about the ger, the stranger. Something that I often think about, like, because I was also thinking about the statistics coming from JOCI about how many Jews of color we have in our community, if 1 in every 7. Um, and it leads me to thinking about B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And so, like, as we are moving through this work, and I kind of have fallen into the same sort of things in some ways, of being like having an Ashkenazi perspective on how I approach my Judaism. If we really look at B'Tselem Elohim, it means that we have to see the full expanse of what our community is, and recognize that in people that don't exactly look, same melanin as us, that we are all the same. And then if we extend that or into the Jewish community, making the assumption that across the board, no matter what the skin color, this person is potentially Jewish, it changes the framing around how we could potentially be approaching this work in the environmental movement. It's such an interesting thing. I was just thinking about, like, my Shabbat practice is I live across the street from the beach, and if it's not raining, I go every day to the beach and spend a few minutes. But specifically on Shabbat, I like to go before the sunset sets and just sort of like take in the entire week. And I recognize for myself that it's not just a Jewish mystical practice. It also is a Yoruban African spirituality practice of tapping in and connecting with my ancestors. And there's a real richness to being able to associate the two, hold both at the same time. That yes, this is a mystical thing, and also there is there's some ancestral energy that's a part of what I do. And I think that, like, as we're evolving this conversation in the next few years, few decades, recognizing that there isn't just one Jewish experience, and that it's the wholeness of how we're bringing all of the parts of ourselves into the work that we do that makes it that much stronger. Um, it's such. I mean, this is one of those things I could go on and on about because racial justice in the Jewish community is my jam. But it's like, what does it look like to have a rebranding of sorts of it not just being so one-sided and just really seeing the multifacetedness of what the Jewish community is in this work.
Yeah. So in a moment, I want us to share some more of just like what that vision is. The one thing I want to pull on just to like really, because I've been thinking about this differently just in the last couple of months, and it's like the reason that we named the session the way we did. I think Judaism and Jewish tradition has so much to offer, and it's really important of like what is our relationship to the other. I mean, that phrase of remember the stranger, the ger. Remember the stranger in your community because you yourselves, the Israelites, right? This is in Torah. You yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. So like, and that's the most commonly repeated phrase in Torah. So it's clearly really important, and like there's no end to how much we should be thinking about what is that relationship to the other. And I mean, this whole thing is about like it's like not only, I mean, I was about to just say, am I catching myself, like the stranger within, right? But it's like that's part of the issue is like if you're still relating to somebody, even if it's from trying to be welcoming as a ger, as an other, you're as a stranger, someone who's different, you're relating to them as an other, and that has a marginalizing effect by itself. And so one, how do we think, like how do we just shift our own thinking and language to saying it's not us and them, it's not the me and you over there, it's us and us, right? Maybe if we pull in some Buber, it's like an I thou, but like it's saying actually this is like the Jewish community. It's not like how do we, the centered Jewish community, welcome the them. It's just like, nope, this is all of us. So that's one. And the other thing that's I think really interesting is, and again, I say this not to undervalue the importance of working with folks that are not Jewish, but I think in the vast majority of the conversations around Jews of color, we're still centering the conversation around what's happening within a specifically Jewish context. So like in a synagogue, in a Jewish community center, like so physical spaces, but also just like in the Jewish community, like how are we welcoming the folks, how are we becoming more equitable, blah, blah, blah. But I think there's another lens that we're not talking about, which is when we are in relationship, and I hope everyone is doing the work to get into relationship with other communities outside the Jewish community, but when we're in relationship with these other communities, maybe in solidarity work, like in partnership, at protest, whatever, right? And especially when those communities are predominantly communities of color. We don't make the connection that the fact that there's a million Jews of color also means that if we're like in the midst of a community of folks of color, that probably a bunch of them could be Jewish, right? Like I feel like we still look at that like collective group of like people of color, right? Like the Black community here, the Asian community here, the blah, blah, blah. And we still assume that they're not Jewish, that none of them are Jewish. And so how does it change the ways that we relate to them? And again, there's a lot of importance to being like, yeah, they're not Jewish. Great. Let's be in solidarity together, right? Let's in collective liberation. So again, don't make it wrong. But how does it also change the conversation when it's like, and a bunch of those people might be Jewish? And like, how does that shift? And I think it's natural that we have our kinship to the folks that feel like they're part of our community, right? That's like, it's just like what we do as humans. And I think that's okay as long as we're thoughtful about it, but to recognize like, oh, maybe it changes how I'm approaching this work or this relationship or this conversation when it's like, you could be Jewish, I don't know, right? Even though I'm in a completely non-Jewish context, I'm in secular work doing whatever, maybe you're Jewish, I don't know, right? And then also when we talk about specifically environmental racism, like again, how does it change? Like if we know that people of color are disproportionately affected by environmental impacts, right? To know that some of those folks are in fact Jewish. And so when we're talking about taking care of the Jewish community, are we really talking about taking care of the entire Jewish community or only the community that's like affluent and white and like lives in the places we think of as Jewish and like, right? Like the folks that are like traditionally centered in what we talk about. So let's move us into just yeah, I want us to share just like a little bit of vision, and then we'll move a little bit and we'll move into our like literally move and then move into our Q&A. So moving into a place of visioning, what does being in community and doing this work from a place of wholeness look like for us? Kristy, do you want to start?
Yeah. I just want to say, like, speaking on what you were just talking about, I think that it's one of those issues that's at the core of environmental racism is how do we see humanity in other people? Because at the end of the day, it's about trying to benefit communities that we may not even be a part of, who are the most marginalized and who are experiencing these impacts. And maybe we are a part of some of those communities as well. But I think it's about like understanding like what's at stake for a lot of communities who don't have the resources and access or the platforms to even like share their story. And so when I'm thinking about seeing the humanity in other people, it is a scary thing to think about, you know, even the history of our people and just like the lack of humanity that has been so pervasive in our society. And I think it's not even just one thing to see the humanity in other people and being the us and us. It's also about like identifying that there is this really big challenge of fighting white supremacy, to denounce it, to consistently say like this cannot exist in our society, to consistently like keep pushing that like there are ideologies out there that have created this us versus them mentality, that have prevented the us and us. And so I think my vision in the future is just like a society where like white supremacy cannot thrive, it cannot be praised, it will not be praised, um, it it won't even be teachable, it will be so obscure that people just feel something in them that cannot, like, will not be allowed to fester. And I just think about that a lot, about like how we continue to teach and cultivate humanity, and the ability to hold humanity and empathy for other people. How do we continue to teach people that? And I think it requires exposing people to as many different perspectives and stories as possible, as soon as possible. And a part of that is validating our experiences and our existence, in these spaces, as you were saying. But I think even beyond that, it's about actually shifting our institutions, to match those needs. Because it's one thing to acknowledge the existence, it's another thing to shift a system to support that, existence. And so I'm always thinking about like, you know, what would it look like to actually have like community programs that were structured around these things, to have this be a consistent conversation, not just this panel, but like how can it actually be integrated, and how do we hold ourselves accountable to that, how are we checking ourselves on that to continue practicing, anti-racism, and so with all that being said, I just think that like sometimes it's easy for us to just say like if only we could just see each other. I think it's more than that. It's not just about seeing each other, it's about knowing where like things are lacking and where things need to shift in order for us to like actually pay back that pain, pay back, you know, the need to shift these systems. Because I think if not, there is going to continue to be this like population of people that have hatred in their hearts and are not able to see that humanity. And I think, the sooner we're able to be honest about that, I think the sooner we're able to get closer to this vision of unity that we want.
Yeah, I just was thinking about that idea of you know, being in deep community with folks, like we were talking about earlier, showing up to a protest for racial justice and then getting into your car and then going home back to your neighborhood, but not really interacting with any of the other folks at that protest or really building community within that. And so I think that the bigger thing of seeing that humanity has to come from deep communication, a deep community where you're actually like engaged with other folks that do not look like you. Not just showing up, in the moment when there's a hashtag that we all are supporting, but really, really being in nuanced, deep community on a day-to-day basis, because through that, it will enable us to see each other's humanity. There's only so much you can read about a person in a book. You're not going to really understand the nuance of that person without being eyeball to, well, COVID, but eyeball to eyeball in some capacity. And the community, that the wholeness that I really want to see for us is a space where there isn't that question of, is this person an other, or who is the other when we're going into a space. It's the assumption that we are all part of working towards the same goal, at the same time recognizing the intersectionality of the individual, and that they're bringing multiple parts of their identity to the table, and deeper understanding around that. And my last thing I'll leave it on is this idea of self-educating. It's an ongoing practice. It's not something where you attend this today and now you're an expert on all things JOC and environmental movement. But it's continual education, like Kristy said, around being an actively anti-racist person. And it doesn't matter what your skin color is. That applies to everyone. And what does it look like really to really be like, oh, so who are you having over for Shabbat? Who's coming to your Shabbos table? Oh, you just had a kid. Oh, so do you need any help with your bris? Like, what does it mean to show up for we're going through COVID-19. People are sitting Shiva all the time. What does it mean to show up for JOCs that are in periods of mourning? So it's like looking at the whole picture and then bringing that forward into this work.
Yeah, so much so. I think when I think about it, it's that we have taken on, for sure, all of us, the anti-racism work. And I think that it's also like being whole in this work means also that like my ability to be whole and Kristy's ability and Nate's ability, right? Like it doesn't take away from, right? This isn't pie, right? Like it's not like the more I have, the less you have, right? It's like cumulative additive, like, it's, I don't know what the other metaphor is, but it's not, it's not slices of pie. And so, and I think this is something that taps into some deep-seated fears. And again, the trauma, which is that the more somebody else takes up their space, that the less space you get. Right. And so for wholeness, for me, it means, yes, I'm able to more fully express my whole self and being, and all, all the Jews of color, but it also means for white Jews, right? That like, I mean, God, we could go on, we could go forever about just like that term, white Jews, like how should we think about it? Whatever, but I'll acknowledge in this moment that it's a very complex, complicated, difficult term, right? And one of the aspects that I want to lift up is that Jews of Ashkenazi / Eastern European, or just in general European descent, etc., like also have, specifically in the last several hundred years, there is so much trauma that has happened to white Jewish bodies, right? Who sometimes was racialized in a slightly different way, and sometimes was just because they're Jew, whatever. But like very similar in the fact of like those folks were told like you are less human, right, than the non-Jewish people here in the next town, or whatever, right? And so that is. And I think Jew, like we just and Sephardim Mizrahi Jews also have like there's trauma everywhere, yay. But like part of the wholeness like means all of us need to figure out like we need to heal that for ourselves, which means I need to be in a deeper relationship with myself, And in fact, Nate, what you mentioned, which I so much believe in getting into a meaningful relationship with others, you know, absolutely. And we're never going to be able to get into truly deep relationship with others if we don't have that deep relationship with ourselves, and if we're not acknowledging and going through a process of healing, because we just live in this like violent world that we're all sort of reeling from and trying, I hope, in our ways to fix. But like we have to get into that healing process for ourselves if we're ever going to do it with ourselves, with others, and with our communities. So with that, we're about to move into Q&A, but I do want to just give us a chance to take a brief little pause and get into our bodies. So again, this is for us here, and for audience, please join us in this. I just want to do a little bit of breathing. So invite you all to close your eyes, get your feet in a grounded position. I'm going to do a sort of brief version of what I call lulav breathing. So Nate was referencing the sukkah and the ushpizin before, which wasn't planned, but here we are, it's perfect. So we're going to take the choreography of the lulav, which is this bundle of plants that we do this sort of rain dance, basically. We're praying for rain, and there's a choreography where we shake it in all four sides around us and above and below. So we're going to do it with our breath. So first, just breathe into the center. Just some nice relaxed breaths. And then we're going to take 3 breaths into the front of our body. So feeling our chest rise and fall. And then 3 deep breaths to the back, allowing our spine to open and close and to elongate. We now breathe into the right side of our body. This is the side of doing, the side of action. So thinking about how am I going to act differently? What am I going to do following this conversation? Then we move our breath into the left side. This is where our heart is. So we give oxygen to our heart, to our feelings and emotions, and allow them to be in us in these conversations, which are bound to stir up some feelings. And then we move into above, so breathing in, feeling our shoulders open, our collarbone, breathing up and giving oxygen to our brains. That's just always doing so much thinking. And now breathing deep into our bellies, allowing ourselves to digest everything that we've been hearing and thinking and feeling in the last hour. And finally, return your breath back to center. And we're breathing deep into the center, but now expansive. So try to feel the breath into all those spaces of the body that we've been breathing into, a full sphere of breath opening and closing. And as we breathe into this 7th dimension, this is the dimension of wholeness, of Shabbat, of peace, of the 7th, of Shalom, of peace, of Shlemut, wholeness. And the 7th dimension is you. So as we move into this final portion, I encourage us to recognize that our presence here, each and every one of us, is vital. And that this conversation is not the same without us in it, and that you are part of what brings wholeness into this space. So take one more deep breath, and you can open your eyes and come back in. So I think we have some questions coming in. If you have some questions from the audience and you haven't put them in yet, please use the Q&A to put them in. Let's go to this first one. I am struggling with my connection to nature due to my lineage from slavery. Does the panel have any suggestions for working through that? Nate, do you feel good starting us off on this?
Yep, I'll jump on this one. That's a real thing. And I want to acknowledge and honor that, because that is also something that I had to overcome myself in the work, because the assumption is that if you're a person of color working in the land, that you're toiling, and that it's hard to find the joy in that. But part of me is like, as we talk about ancestral DNA and intergenerational trauma, there's also intergenerational strength. And what I live into in those moments is it took extraordinary strength to make it through the transatlantic slave trade. So the DNA that made it to the United States, there's something special there. And then also, it's in our DNA to be able to understand the land, not just from the years of being enslaved in the US, but acknowledging that we had a connection to the land in Africa. It's been documented that there were girls that had okra seeds braided into their hair, and that's how part of the reason why we have okra in the United States. So the connection to the land didn't just start with slavery, and the way I like to view it for myself is it's reclaiming what that looks like today. I mentioned my great grandfather Horace Hill, whose parents were slaves. He was one of the only farmers in his area that owned his land outright and wasn't a sharecropper, and had all kinds of ingenuitive things on his farm. One of them being water reclamation, and we're the first ones to have electricity at the farm in that area for Black folks. But what I like to take from that is he was a visionary of his time, using the resources around the land. What does it look like for us with all of this additional knowledge to be the visionaries of our time and pull on that wellspring of strength of our ancestors?
Yeah. I'll also just offer a resource. Leah Penniman, who is one of the founders of Soulfire Farm, she has a book called Farming While Black. Um, she's just an amazing, human and really leader in the community. And so um, she talks a lot about this very question, and has just a lot of tremendous wisdom to offer. So I definitely recommend folks check out her work. Um, yeah, I mean, I think part of this too is, um, for me as Chinese, with Chinese heritage, like I don't have at least American slavery, that I know of. But one of the things I do think of and I think this is something that as Jews of color is pretty common. Like we do have, I think we have, what am I saying? We have additional compounding levels of what it means for us to be in diaspora. I mean, I think the question of what does it mean to be in diaspora is fundamental. It's like a fundamental Jewish question, and that's a lot of how I really relate to what it means to be Jewish, and how does that inform my exploration of being in relationship with this land and place, and also and also how does that inform how I try to be in relationship with the folks who are indigenous to this land, right? Which I am not, and what does that relationship look like, and that learning and the sources of wisdom. But I think for Jews of color, the ways in which we are in diaspora, I feel often there's a certain amount of the trauma of land displacement and questions that are both in common with the general Jewish story and then also have some particularities. And I think one of the things I really love is being able to sort of use the relationship to nature to be a healing force in terms of just sort of healing those relationships. Kristy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak specifically to slavery and that specific trauma, but I just think my own experience of I don't know, being Filipino, Philip there's a lot of trauma with the Philippines being consistently colonized and, not having a sense of identity and not knowing how to navigate things. So I can only speak through that experience. But for me, a big part of it was connecting with nature in my own area. So a big part for me was just doing birding. It's just doing bird watching in your own backyard, at your own house. That's honestly been a really powerful mindfulness technique that I've done on a daily basis. So it's I think for a long time, I felt like I couldn't say I was really connected to nature because I didn't really go on camping trips. I didn't really know about like how to do backpacking. So I felt really intimidated, and I felt like an imposter. I was like, I don't really know. I'm not really connected to nature. I can't even call myself brown girl green because I don't even know what the green part is. And then I was like, actually, like going on hikes, going to a local neighborhood park, looking at birds, like that is something that anyone can do. And I think that that's really powerful, and is something that like we need to continue to reframe, that like having access to nature and having this connection is a matter of perspective. Um, and that's a good way to start to feel safer in your body, and to consistently practice like, I'm here, I'm safe, let me look at this tree that's just near me. And most people can see trees, and trees are so powerful to even touch, to even look at. When you're just sitting with your body, even when things feel chaotic, if you just look at a tree and you're like, I'm going to channel tree energy right now, like you will feel more stable throughout your day. I promise you. Putting your feet in some grass, like it doesn't have to be this really big dramatic, like I'm going to go on this expedition for 5 weeks to find myself. Like it can be a daily practice of like finding yourself every day. So
Yeah.
that's what I'd like to say.
And I would even add, I mean, there are this is again like, yeah, that there's no one right way to spend time in nature, right? And yeah, Chris, you're saying like, oh yeah, I don't know how to backpack, I don't know this, and it's, I think there's just um there are these archetypes in just like the nature environmentalism blah 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 community, that for those of us who don't fit into those archetypes, yeah, it's like, oh, like how can I tap into, this thing? It's like, I don't like, maybe I don't want to summit Mount Everest, or the like, the like degrees like down from that, and it's sort of like this whole, I think that's part of the, it's funny because like I feel like the nature community often thinks of themselves, of ourselves, as countercultural, which to an extent it is, but like how are we like like how are we countercultural to the counterculture, right? But it's like the ways in which there, you can have this approach to nature, which is which is like which is its own iteration of a highly individualistic culture that I think is part of U.S. society, right? Which is just that like it's the individual climber, explorer, like putting the flag in the ground, personal accomplishment. And so I would say one of the ways that feels really important for me is to like, that's not the only way to be in nature. And like, actually, like, absolutely, like we need to be, what does it mean to be in community in nature? What does it mean? I think also about, and this is also just like, where do we learn the wisdom from, right? But like, what does it mean to move through nature, not only on a solo trek, but I'm thinking about communities that, for example, like what if you're a community that was moving through nature and had little babies, right? Because that was part of your like life, and it means that like it's not only on the one person, like the one mother, to like be the only one carrying her baby for miles, like baby would get passed around, and like and so like there's all these ways in which that we like collectively being in nature, that I think we don't often think of as sort of like the archetype, and so I think this is part of it. So let me know, if you all are seeing anything else in the questions that you want to make sure to touch on. I'm also scanning through.
So I'm seeing a question. I just saw the question about tokenization. Tokenizing Jews of color is a concern. Operating a local community organization of Jews and allies, specifically recently made by Black Lives Matter. So haven't gotten any flack about white fragility. Um, uh, let's see. Current thoughts is I have what is well, excuse me. Current thoughts I have is what to do I do with someone in our community who does not agree with our statement in location where the reputation is scarce of visibility. Representation is scarce of visibility. So this is essentially asking what are some of the things that we can offer advice on around tokenization of Jews of color, and not centering white fragility in the process. I have some thoughts, but if anyone else has something that's burning on this one, I'll yield to you.
No, you please take it.
So this is it's something that I think about often, regularly in my work, in my Jewish professional capacity as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, and manager of racial justice initiatives at Avodah, because it's often a question of how do we bring people to the table without just making it a check box that we have someone of color at the table. And there's a lot of nuance to that, and part of I think that there's someone that says it's not an it's as long as you have three, the minimum should be three of us, three people of color or three Jews of color in the room. One is not enough, because if you have three of us, then you're starting to get a little bit more diversity of opinion. The question also becomes, when do you think about bringing Jews of color to the conversation? Is it specifically around something related to race, or is it for their individual expertise in something outside of race, but they just also happen to be a person of color? So part of it is the differentiation between why and how you're bringing someone to the table, and what capacity they are in once they are at the table. Is it just for them to put on a show, entertain people, make them feel good, tell their story, and go on their way? Or is it something about bringing that person to the table to really work about institutional structures and changes to strategies? One thing that I'm going to plug in the chat is, Avodah developed a racial justice guide specifically for Jewish nonprofit organizations, and part of what it does is touch on the different aspects of how to avoid tokenism through moving through other parts of looking at your organization, because perhaps there needs to be internal work within the organization before you can bring Jews of color to the table, because you might just be bringing Jews of color into a toxic space. So you need to do the work at home before you can bring Jews of color into the work. But I think that this is a really important question, and I'm excited to see folks chewing on, like, how do we really engage this work without it being on the backs of others?
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate the like hire or bring in Jews of color or like elevate Jews of color to do work that is not only racial equity work, right? Like, there's lots of JOC and like POC in the broader world who like do this work, do DEI work, are really good at like. So yes, like hire those people, right? You know, and but also like, I mean, this is something that happens all the time in the Jewish community and outside, is like an over reliance on people of color to be driving the racial equity initiatives, to do the education, to like, you know, have to. And it's sort of like, for me, I think on the one hand, especially with as I've gotten just more involved in this, it's like on the one hand, it's like it's hard for me and now to imagine doing the work I do without having the racial equity lens and trying to be anti-racist in my personal work and in organization. So like, of course, I'm doing those things, and there's ways I've made it explicitly parts of different things. And at the same time, like, there's also just like work that I want to do that's not directly, obviously racial. You know what I mean? That's just like cool, awesome, like work that I think is just like, I'll just like good for the Jews, like, you know what I mean? And like, there's so many Jews of color who are doing that, right? And so I think, you know, and I'll just say like, I really strongly believe in the racial equity work, right? I'm always trying to work at getting better at it, right? And I really believe it. And like, I'm exhausted. And I know it's pretty much every JSC I know. We're just so tired. And so, so I'll just say like, yeah, that please, yeah, please like elevate Jews of color to like, just like bring our Torah, because it's really good Torah, or like Jewish wisdom and the ways that we're like creating new Jewish wisdom, to just like bring that into the work, right? And don't just assume that the only work that we're capable of doing is racial equity work, because we got a lot more to offer. Kristy, whether you want to speak directly to this and any other just like part of you want to share.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say that like someone commented and said, like, these are all such good questions. I wish we could like talk more about all these things. Someone asked like, what might it look like to bring consciousness around the presence of JOC in our community, environmental racism, to a primarily white, older, traditional Jewish community? I really like this question because I'm like the youngest person in my family, and especially on my dad's side of the family, I'm like the only, like, my family specifically, is the only like Jews of color on that side of my family. And everyone else is like older white folks on my dad's side of the family. And anyways, they're a lot more conservative. They're a lot like less open to some of these ideas. But once I started, going from a place of like, these people love me and like they want to hear my story and how I'm navigating these things, I kind of just like put it there. I was like, I love you, but I'm also going to challenge you. And I'm going to challenge you because I love you. And I think that's like the space we need to operate out of. Like, if you really love people, you're going to push them to do better, in my opinion. You're not going to just allow them to continue to like perpetuate, the status quo, because that not only hurts you, but it hurts other people. And I think if, you're trying to practice love in action, it's really important that you're maintaining that transparency. And so I would say like my advice is like telling your story in the most authentic way possible. If there's JOCs in this audience, I would say also just recognizing that they're probably going to be, resistant and not want to listen to you at first, but listen to their perspectives. What are their gaps on like why those ideas are so radical to them, or like that bothers them, or how they liked things that used to be. Really practice active listening, and then, make that agreement that they're going to practice that back. And either they will or they won't, but at least you like put yourself out there to share that experience, and maybe they'll walk away with one or two things that they weren't thinking about because they're constantly surrounded by people who think exactly like them. So that's my advice.
Thanks, Kristy. Nate, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, just one quick thing. Something I like to challenge people to do, just kind of piggybacking off what Kristy said, is I always like to challenge people to engage in a conversation with someone of a different generation than themselves. So if you're someone of an older generation, sit down and have a conversation with someone one or two generations removed from you, because there's some real deep learning and understanding that can come out of that. That's the one thing that I have to leave y'all with. Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks so much, Nate. So folks, if anyone needs to, it's 32 past the hour. If anyone's like, I had a meeting that started 5 minutes ago. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to sing us out because music's good. We're now officially in like Shabbat time, where it's like, we're not going to take so much longer, but like, we're just like in time. In time is on time, as our teacher Avila likes to say. So I'm just going to sing a little bit. And if you want to stay on for, 3-4 more minutes and enjoy some singing and sing along from your Zoom cube, please do. Thank you, Nate, and thank you, Kristy, so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Nate, Kristy, if you want to pop into the chat, make sure it's going to all attendees. Just how folks can follow your work and stay in touch, that would be fantastic. And yeah, we're just gonna sing a little bit as we approach Shabbat, a Shabbat that I hope is full of wholeness and peace. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Please feel free to put in the chat from folks, what do you want to let shine moving forward this Shabbat and moving forward. I'm going to say, I'll kick us off. All of my JOC community, I'm going to let them shine. All the JOC, I'm going to let them shine. All my JOC family, I'm going to let them shine. Let them shine, let them shine, let them shine. Nate, what do you want to shine?
Peace and love.
So much peace and love, we're gonna let them shine. hope and joy. Hope and joy. We're gonna let them shine. So much hope and joy. We're gonna let them shine. So much hope and joy. We're gonna let them shine. Let them shine. Let them shine. Let them shine. All right, just a little bit more from folks in the chat. Let's see what we got. Yeah, we got hope already. Our comment, humanity. Here we go. Comment, humanity. We're gonna let that shine. Acceptance and authenticity. We're gonna let it shine. The possibility of love everywhere. We're gonna definitely let that shine. With respect, worldwide love. Let it shine. Here we go one final time. Sing along. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. These great lights of ours surrounding us, we're gonna let them shine. These great lights of ours, we're gonna let them shine. Let them shine. Let them shine. Let them shine. Thank you so much, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. I'll put my contact in the chat right now. It's hard to type and play at the same time, so I'll do that now. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks so much, everyone.